The canyon trembled with silence before the strike. Edward said, "Survival never asks permission." A sudden shadow cut across the stone as the eagle dove, claws outstretched, eyes burning with primal fire. Margaret gasped, "The sky itself is falling." Dust exploded upward, as talons shredded into prey below, the sound raw and merciless. Nathaniel shouted, "Death comes before breath is drawn." The mountain air howled, like a scream caught between cliffs. Blood scattered the rock, shining red against pale stone. The prey's cry died in an instant, swallowed by silence more terrifying than the strike. Edward whispered, "This is nature's law." The silence stretched heavier than the strike itself. Edward said, "Every kill redraws the map of survival." Margaret's voice cracked, "The earth remembers every drop of blood." Nathaniel turned from the scene, fists trembling, and yet it never stops. The eagle stood still, guarding its prey as though the canyon belonged to it alone. Wind scraped across stone, carrying the copper tang of blood. The sun rose higher, burning the scene in sharp light, unforgiving and absolute. Edward whispered, "Life begins where another ends." The canyon felt narrower, as though stone walls leaned inward. Margaret whispered, "The sky has teeth." Edward replied, "And no creature escapes its bite." Nathaniel stared upward, eyes narrowing at the predator's shadow etched against light. The eagle's cry split the silence, raw and metallic. Its dominance weighed on the survivors like chains, reminding them that survival was not chosen but endured. Blood glistened, sharp against dust, painting the law they could never rewrite. Edward said, "The sky shows no mercy, only power." Margaret clutched her cloak tighter, whispering, "Power feeds on weakness." Nathaniel's voice shook with fury, "And weakness is always chosen as prey." The eagle shifted, talons scraping stone, feathers glinting like steel under sunlight. Its stare pierced downward, indifferent yet absolute. The canyon echoed with silence again, as though holding breath. The survivors felt the weight of inevitability pressing harder than stone, a truth carved into every shadow. The strike was over, but its echo lingered like thunder that refused to fade. Edward whispered, "This silence is more violent than the kill." Margaret said, "Because silence never ends." Nathaniel looked down at the lifeless prey, muttering, "And neither does hunger." The eagle lifted its head, eyes burning with possession, wings half raised in defiance of the world. The canyon stretched vast and cold, but in that moment, it belonged only to the predator. Every shadow bowed to it, every breath bent to its rule. The canyon fell quiet, yet the silence no longer carried fear alone, but a fragile weight of endurance. Edward said, "The eagle bleeds, yet still it rises." Margaret's eyes followed its ragged wings as they trembled against the pale sky, whispering, "It carries scars heavier than the prey it takes." Nathaniel leaned against the stone, his voice low, "Strength is not its weapon, survival is." The predator was no longer an untouchable shadow. Its body bore wounds carved by storms and rivals unseen. Its flight faltered, each beat straining, as if life hung by threads stretched too thin. The watchers felt their fear soften into something else, an unexpected bond with the creature they had dreaded. Margaret's breath caught. "It is not immortal, it is only enduring." The truth struck harder than claws. Weakness lived in everything, even in those who ruled the sky. The watchers drew closer to the ledge, their breaths shallow, hearts moved by what they saw. Edward whispered, "Every scar tells a story carved in flight." Margaret murmured, "And every story holds the threat of ending." The eagle circled once more, slower now, wings heavy, a king diminished yet unyielding. Nathaniel muttered, "Even the mighty fall, but they do not surrender easily." The canyon wind carried the smell of iron and dust, as if the world itself inhaled the memory of countless battles. Margaret pressed her hand against her chest, whispering, "We fear it because we see ourselves in it." For a fleeting moment, predator and prey, human and beast, seemed bound by the same fragile thread of survival. In that mirror of fragility, empathy grew, unwanted, but undeniable. The eagle descended toward a ledge, claws scraping stone, body trembling as if gravity had won half the battle. Edward said, "Even the air resists it now." Margaret whispered, "But it does not stop." Nathaniel's voice cracked, because stopping is death. The predator landed heavily, wings folding with shuddering effort, chest heaving. For the first time it seemed less like a ruler and more like a survivor clawing against inevitability. Margaret stepped forward, whispering, "Its strength is not in power, but in refusal to fall." The watchers understood. Fragility was not weakness but endurance made visible. The eagle, scarred and tired, was not invincible. And because of that, it was something far greater, alive. The mountain wind tore through the canyon, yet the eagle did not flee. It faced into it, feathers rattling, body quivering but unbroken. Edward whispered, "It stands against storms as it stands against death." Margaret's eyes glistened. Every moment alive is defiance. Nathaniel said, "Perhaps its greatest strength is not victory, but its refusal to surrender." The watchers felt the truth claw into them. Fragility was the anchor, the reason life mattered. The eagle's gaze was sharp, golden eyes unyielding despite weakness. Margaret breathed, "We are bound to it, not because it kills, but because it endures." In its struggle they saw not terror, but a mirror of themselves. The sun dipped lower, shadows carving deeper lines across the canyon. The eagle remained, scarred yet steadfast, as though every breath declared its right to exist. Edward said, "Survival is not strength, it is defiance." Margaret's voice cracked, "And defiance is the only crown worth wearing." Nathaniel added, "What we feared has become what we honor." The watchers no longer looked upon a predator, but upon a survivor whose story was carved in scars. The canyon echoed with silence, yet this silence was different, filled not with dread but reverence. Margaret whispered, "It teaches us that fragility is not weakness, it is life." And in that moment they knew the eagle had become more than creature. It was the anchor of all their fear, hope, and endurance. The canyon no longer felt still. Shadows shifted with the weight of unseen threats. Edward whispered, "The silence is breaking." Margaret's voice shook, "Something hunts the hunter." Nathaniel scanned the skies, his jaw tight. Above, the eagle wheeled uneasily, wings stiff, head snapping sharply toward the horizon. A dark figure rose in the distance, slicing across the light. Another bird, larger, its flight faster, hungrier. Margaret gasped, "The rival has come." The wind carried a shriek, fierce and cutting, a sound that stripped away the fragile reverence of moments before. Edward said, "The fight has only begun." The survivors felt the shift like a storm gathering, every heartbeat a countdown to violence. The rival drew closer, cutting the air with precision, every beat of its wings a threat written across the sky. Edward muttered, "It comes for blood, not survival." Margaret whispered, "It is hunger wrapped in bone and feather." The first eagle flared its wings, trembling but resolute, a defender of both territory and fragile life. Nathaniel's voice dropped low, "The canyon is not wide enough for two rulers." The watchers stood frozen, powerless before nature's merciless law. Talons gleamed in sunlight as the rivals shrieked again, a sound sharp as iron. Margaret's eyes filled. "Survival is never shared," Edward said, "and only one will fall." The sky became a battlefield, each breath a prelude to impact. The first clash shattered the sky. Talons met with a scream of feathers, wings colliding with the sound of tearing cloth. Edward shouted, "They are tearing life apart." Margaret cried, "It is the sky itself breaking." The rival pressed downward, heavier, stronger, its force a storm given flesh. The scarred eagle fought back, striking upward with desperate claws, refusing surrender. Nathaniel's voice shook, "It fights with nothing but refusal." Blood rained briefly, a red streak against pale air. The canyon carried the echo, a drumbeat of violence that seemed eternal. Margaret whispered, "Every strike is a heartbeat lost." Edward muttered, and the heart can only break so many times. The duel dragged across the sky, feathers drifting down like blackened snow. Edward whispered, "The air itself bleeds." Margaret sobbed, every wing beat is pain. The scarred eagle faltered, one wing bending awkwardly, yet still it struck upward, defiant. The rival circled faster, carving arcs of dominance, its shadow blotting out the sun. Nathaniel's teeth clenched, its circles like death waiting to close its fist. The canyon wind carried screams of rage, both predator and rival, locked in merciless ritual. Margaret whispered, "It cannot last forever." Edward muttered, "No battle ever does, but endings are never gentle." Their hearts thudded in rhythm with the chaos above, every moment an eternity of fear. The final strike of the act thundered across the canyon. The rival dove with unrelenting fury, claws outstretched, the weight of inevitability behind it. Edward shouted, "This is the end." Margaret's voice cracked, "It cannot endure." Yet the scarred eagle flared its wings wide, bracing against the impossible. Talons met once more, a sound sharp enough to slice the world in two. Blood scattered, feathers spiraled downward, and silence fell for a breathless instant. Nathaniel whispered, "In survival there is no mercy, only cost." Margaret closed her eyes, "And the cost is always life." Edward's voice trembled, "One will fall, and the sky will remember." The watchers stood paralyzed, chained to the fate unfolding above. The battle stilled for a fleeting breath, and in that pause, the truth bared itself like bone beneath torn flesh. Edward whispered, "It is not only hunter against hunter." Margaret's eyes widened. The rival is not a shadow, it is a mother. The larger eagle circled, blood dripping, and beneath her feathers, the watchers saw the frail outline of hunger, not for dominance, but for survival of something unseen. Nathaniel muttered, "It carries the weight of its own brood." The scarred eagle steadied itself, chest heaving, not only fighting for territory but for breath. Margaret's voice broke, "This is not war, it is desperation mirrored." Edward clenched his fists, the law of survival pits need against need, and both are equally merciless. The watcher's fear dissolved into dread, for every victor in this fight carried loss carved into its wings. The revelation struck heavier than claws. Edward whispered, "Every wound carries the weight of another's hunger." Margaret gasped. She fights not for herself, but for the unseen waiting in shadows. Nathaniel said, "And the scarred one fights because it has no choice but to endure." Above, feathers fell like ash, drifting between rivals locked in circles that mirrored eternity. The canyon no longer echoed violence alone. It echoed the cries of young unseen, and the rasp of an old survivor refusing surrender. Margaret whispered, "The fight is not of cruelty but of need." Edward muttered, "And nature spares no one, whether they fight for blood or for breath." The watchers realized they stood inside a story not of predators but of survivors, who wore different faces of suffering. The air split with another cry, but this one carried no triumph, only exhaustion. Edward said, "They are breaking against each other like waves on stone." Margaret's tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "There is no victory here, only survival borrowed from death." Nathaniel's fists shook. One carries the scars of storms, the other carries the burden of mouths unfed. Above, talons scraped yet faltered, wings collided, then staggered apart. Neither predator struck true, their strength swallowed by weakness heavier than flesh. Margaret cried softly, "The truth is merciless, both deserve life, yet one must fall." Edward muttered, "This is nature's greatest cruelty, truth without justice." The canyon pulsed with dread, a heartbeat too vast to silence. The canyon wind carried the sound of wings beating slower, ragged with fatigue. Edward whispered, "The air itself resists them now." Margaret trembled, "It is not a fight, it is collapse." Nathaniel said, "And collapse chooses no mercy." The rivals circled low, neither strong enough to strike cleanly, both too desperate to withdraw. Feathers clung to the wind like dying stars. carried into the abyss of stone. Margaret cried, "We are watching survival devour itself." Edward lowered his head. "This is the hidden truth. We cheer for survival, yet survival always feeds on loss." Nathaniel's voice grew hollow, "And the cost will echo long after one is gone." The watchers stood powerless as despair deepened, heavier than the fight itself. The truth landed heavier than stone, and the watchers could no longer bear the silence. Edward whispered, "They are both survivors, yet only one will be allowed to remain." Margaret's voice broke. "Survival is not justice, it is sacrifice carved into blood." Nathaniel's eyes darkened, and the canyon never keeps its promises, it only keeps echoes. The rivals met once more, wings faltering, talons scraping yet failing to finish. It was not a strike of strength but of exhaustion, of bodies refusing surrender even as collapse loomed. Margaret whispered, "Every breath is borrowed, and the debt will be collected." Edward muttered, "The hidden truth of survival is that it spares no one, not even the victors." The watchers braced for the inevitable fall, hearts weighted by dread. The air cracked with fury as the rival dove, wings folded like blades. Edward shouted, "This is the strike that decides everything." Margaret's cry split the silence. "It cannot withstand such force." The scarred eagle flared wide, a desperate shield forged of broken feathers. Talons crashed, feathers burst like embers, blood streaked across the wind. Nathaniel roared, "Every breath is war." The canyon shuddered with echoes of violence, each clash a drumbeat of survival. Edward muttered, "The sky writes its law in blood." Margaret whispered, "But even blood cannot tell who deserves to live." Their words bled into the chaos, powerless against nature's merciless judgment. The rival pressed downward, heavier and faster, claws grinding against flesh. Edward gasped, "It is crushing him." Margaret's voice cracked, "But he will not fall." The scarred eagle twisted, striking upward with raw defiance, tearing the rival's wing in a spray of feathers. Nathaniel shouted, "It fights with nothing but pain." Their screams vanished under the shriek of two predators locked in deadly embrace. The sky seemed to tremble, clouds spiraling apart as if recoiling from the chaos. Edward whispered, "This is not victory. This is survival screaming." Margaret sobbed, and screaming cannot last forever. The canyon roared with echoes, binding their fear into the eternal fight above. The fight spiraled lower, closer to stone, as if the earth itself demanded tribute. Edward shouted, "They are falling together." Margaret cried, "The canyon will decide their fate." Talons raked, wings collided, blood fell in red arcs against the pale rock below. Nathaniel's voice shook, "No creature survives without cost, and cost is always blood." The scarred eagle struck downward, desperate to break free, while the rival shrieked, answering with merciless rage. Dust burst upward as shadows danced across cliffs. Edward whispered, "They will tear each other apart before surrendering." Margaret sobbed, "And in their ruin, we see ourselves." The canyon swallowed their cries, as if silence waited to claim them both. The rivals struck again, slashing deep, and blood painted the wind in long ribbons. Edward gasped, "Every wound is another heartbeat stolen." Margaret's tears streaked her face, and yet it still resists. The scarred eagle clawed desperately, wings trembling, strength drained yet spirit unbroken. Nathaniel's voice thundered, "It will not surrender even as death closes in." The canyon roared with sound, wind and violence, as if the world itself was torn open. Edward muttered, "Survival is no triumph, it is torment endured." Margaret whispered, "And torment never spares the innocent." Their words hung beneath the storm above, powerless witnesses to nature's cruelest truth. The climax tore through the sky in one final collision. Edward shouted, "This is the last strike." Margaret cried, "One must fall." The rival dove with talons stretched, merciless and precise. The scarred eagle rose with wings torn but wide, defiance burning in its golden eyes. Their bodies clashed in a scream of feathers, the sound louder than thunder. Blood erupted, feathers drifted like dying stars, and silence followed for a heartbeat too long. Nathaniel whispered, "Survival is not mercy, it is the weight of sacrifice." Margaret's sob carried, "And sacrifice is the crown of the living." Edward muttered, "One falls, one endures, and neither escapes the cost." The canyon roared as fate struck its final blow. The clash ended in silence, broken only by wind, feathers spiraling downward like torn leaves. Edward whispered, "The fight is over." Margaret pressed her hands to her face, trembling, but the silence feels heavier than the strike. Nathaniel muttered, "Because silence means truth, and truth means loss." The scarred eagle drifted downward, battered but alive, wings shaking as though every feather carried the weight of death. The rival fell past it, twisting, body broken against the stone below. Margaret sobbed, "Survival never spares both." Edward's jaw tightened. "It never spares anyone, it only postpones the inevitable." The canyon swallowed the rival's fall with a hollow echo, eternal and merciless. Nathaniel whispered, "Victory is not survival, it is endurance bought with grief." The survivors' breaths came shallow, as if the fall had stolen air from them too. Edward whispered, "The canyon has chosen." Margaret cried, "But it did not choose mercy." Nathaniel's voice cracked, "It never does." The scarred eagle landed heavily on the ledge, talons scraping stone, chest rising and falling in sharp gasps. Its eyes burned not with triumph but exhaustion, a creature that had endured only because it refused surrender. Edward said, "It lives but not unbroken." Margaret whispered, "Survival is a crown of scars, not of glory." Nathaniel closed his eyes, "And the crown is heavier than death itself." The canyon wind carried the metallic scent of blood, binding the moment with the permanence of stone. The canyon held still, as though honoring the dead. Edward muttered, "The fallen will not rise, but their absence fills the sky." Margaret whispered, "Every shadow now carries their memory." Nathaniel said, "And memory is sharper than talons." The scarred eagle stood motionless, chest heaving, eyes fixed beyond the horizon, as though searching for what had been lost. The watchers felt the burden of survival press against their hearts. Edward said, "The law is written not in victory but in loss." Margaret replied, "And loss lingers longer than life." Nathaniel's fists trembled. "Survival is a wound that never heals, it only deepens." The canyon gave no answer, only silence that stretched like an open grave. As night bled across the horizon, the watchers realized they had seen not a victory, but a truth revealed in ruin. Edward whispered, "It survives, but it will never be whole." Margaret's voice trembled. "Wholeness is not what nature gives, it only gives survival." Nathaniel muttered, "And even survival is temporary." The eagle shifted, wings drooping, talons gripping stone as if to remind itself it was still alive. Its eyes burned with something beyond strength, endurance sharpened by suffering. Edward said, "This is the resolution. No glory, no justice, only life that endures." Margaret whispered, "And life that endures is life marked forever." Nathaniel's silence was answer enough. Darkness settled, wrapping the canyon in silence deeper than any cry. Edward whispered, "The fight has ended, but the cost will echo forever." Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, murmuring, "Survival is a wound carved into time." Nathaniel said, "And time carries every scar." The scarred eagle lifted its head toward the stars, wings trembling but still stretched wide, a silent testament to endurance. The watchers stood still, humbled, knowing they had witnessed not triumph but inevitability. Edward whispered, "The circle has closed and nothing escapes its edge." Margaret's tears glistened in starlight, not even hope. Nathaniel muttered, "Survival is absolute, and absolute is merciless." The canyon whispered back, only with wind, eternal and indifferent. The night pressed close, the canyon trembling in silence heavier than storm. Edward whispered, "The world no longer breathes the same." Margaret shivered, "Every shadow holds the echo of the fallen." Above, the scarred eagle circled slowly, its wings trembling but wide, a survivor painted in scars and blood. Nathaniel muttered, "Survival does not heal, it only lingers." The wind carried the faint cry of the living, yet beneath it the silence of the dead screamed louder. Edward's voice cracked. "Life does not crown victors, it crowns survivors," Margaret said. "And crowns are nothing but thorns pressed into flesh." The canyon lay vast and dark, but its emptiness pulsed with presence, as if it would forever carry the weight of the blood shed within. The watchers stood in silence, every heartbeat echoing the fight they could not forget. Edward muttered, "Every victory tastes of loss." Margaret said softly, "And every loss remains eternal." The eagle rose higher into the night, each wing beat heavy, every motion written in pain. Nathaniel's jaw trembled. "We honor it not for its strength, but for its endurance." Above, feathers drifted down like dark snow, falling slow and endless, each one a relic of the struggle. Edward whispered, "These are not wings of triumph, but of survival's burden." Margaret's eyes glistened, burden carried into the silence. The canyon's stillness grew oppressive, as though the stone itself had swallowed their grief and carved it into eternity. The wind shifted, carrying the echo of the rival's fall, a silence more violent than sound. Edward whispered, "The sky remembers even when the world forgets." Margaret's voice cracked, and remembrance is heavier than life itself. The scarred eagle tilted in flight, wings faltering but still refusing collapse. Nathaniel muttered, "Even in weakness it refuses to fall." The watchers felt their fear turn to reverence, their dread to mourning. Edward said, "What we saw was not power, but truth." Margaret breathed, "And truth cuts deeper than talons." The canyon stretched endless beneath them, no longer an empty chasm, but a grave carved into stone. Nathaniel lowered his head. "Survival has no glory, only echoes." The survivors gathered near the ledge, unable to speak for long moments, until Edward whispered, "The sky has shown us its cruelty." Margaret trembled, but also its fragility. The eagle soared higher, silhouetted against the stars, every beat a struggle that echoed through the canyon below. Nathaniel muttered, "Every survivor is both scar and memory." The night carried no storm, no scream, only the oppressive stillness of loss. Edward's voice cracked, "We cannot look away, because in it we see ourselves." Margaret whispered, "And what we see is fragility that endures." Nathaniel closed his eyes, and endurance is the only truth the night allows. Silence folded around them, pressing heavier than stone. The final cry came sharp, piercing the night, fading into silence that would never end. Edward whispered, "The living carry the echo of the dead." Margaret's tears glistened as she said, "And echoes never fade." Nathaniel's voice fell low. "Survival is not an end, but the beginning of memory." The eagle soared once more into the sky, wings stretched though torn, a silhouette etched against eternity. For a moment, it seemed endless, a shadow carved into stars. Then it vanished into the night, leaving only silence. Edward muttered, "The canyon will hold this moment forever." Margaret breathed, "And so will we." Nathaniel whispered, "The echo has become eternal." The watchers stood motionless, bound in silence, unable to forget.